Who's that coming in?
That's Chuck.
I hope he's checked the windsock.
Isn't that Chuck Williams coming in?
That runway's too hard, Sam. He's looking for a soft landing in the grass.
You okay, Chuck?
Head hurts a little. I guess I'm okay.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm okay. Man, how did I make such a mess?
I don't know, Chuck. How did it happen?
I'm not sure. Everything seemed to be all right until I touched down. All of a sudden, I seemed to lose control.
You look a little shaky. Let's get you out of here. Bill, Bob, you want to take care of the airplane till we get a truck out?
Sure, go ahead.
As we get up to the hangar, we better call the FAA.
Wish I knew what happened.
Well, it could have been worse. At least you walked away from it. I'll look the plane over later on, Chuck. Come around tomorrow night and I'll give you a full report.
Where will I find you?
At ground school. I'm giving a refresher course for some of the pilots. As you've just seen, pilot error has been with us as long as the airplane. Most of you may know that we had an accident here on the field yesterday afternoon. Pilot lost control during a landing in a moderate crosswind. Although there was nobody there to shake his hand, we're all happy to say that he walked away. Most of you know Chuck Williams here. He learned to fly at this school a couple of years ago, and he's here tonight because he wants to find out why the accident happened and what he could have done to avoid it. Let's see if we can't help him find the answers. Yesterday was a pretty good day for flying. Ceiling was unlimited with scattered cumulus. Visibility was good without smoke or haze, and the wind was from the northeast at 10 knots with gusts to 15. And that's where the trouble started. As you all know, our runway runs almost due north and south. Along about 2 o'clock, Chuck came in his Piper Colt, circled the field, checked the pattern for other traffic, and made his final approach. Chuck, suppose you tell us what happened from there on.
As I turned into final, I reduced power a little more and lined up with the runway. I corrected by crabbing into the wind. Tried to keep the plane lined up with the runway, holding the proper crab.
In other words, with the plane in that attitude, you were crabbing as you approached the runway.
That's right.
All right, hold it for a minute, Chuck. Was there any other way he could have lined up the airplane with the runway and kept it there without drifting?
He could have lowered the upwind wing, keeping the nose straight with the rudder.
And what would that have done?
Well, the lowered wing would have created a slip toward the wind, which would in turn help prevent drifting away from the runway center line.
That's right, Bill. You can either crab the airplane, or you can slip the airplane into the wind by lowering the upwind wing. Or you can use a combination of the two. Chuck, take it from there.
As I approached the runway, I still had control. I didn't seem to be crabbing very much as I touched down, and I figured that once the wheels were on the ground, they'd roll forward and the plane would straighten itself out. I felt the wheels touch the ground, but it didn't seem right.
I'm not surprised. Your wheels were skidding sideways down the runway with the nose of the airplane into the wind. That means your wheels are at an angle not only to the runway, but to the forward motion of the plane. But there was a time during that landing when something could have been done. Any ideas? Beverly.
Just before touchdown, I think.
Why just before touchdown?
Well, during his final approach, he elected to keep his nose into the wind, crabbing so that he wouldn't drift off the runway. But just before touchdown, he could have lowered the wing, the one that was into the wind, and used the rudder to point the nose straight down the runway.
Sure, that's right. Why didn't I do it? I remember learning how to make crosswind landings before I took my private flight test. I guess I expected the tricycle gear to do more than it was designed for.
I think you've got your answer, Chuck. There are other techniques, but do you understand this one?
I'll never forget it.
Well, don't go away just yet. We're just getting warmed up. We've never really talked about accidents in this class. Maybe now's a good time to do it. There's usually one common denominator in most general aviation accidents, and that's a human element. The pilot flying the aircraft. It's a fact that most accidents happen on and around airports, usually during landings and takeoffs. Many of them are due to loss of control, and control rests with that common denominator, the pilot. We've got one of those common denominator types here with us in class tonight. Not too many months ago, he undershot the runway in one of his early solo flights. How about it, Bob?
Well, there really isn't much to tell.
Well, suppose you come on up and tell us anyway.
Well, like Sam said, there I was up in the wild blue by myself. One of my first trips outside the pattern. The flight had been very smooth. Everything was coming up roses until I came into land. I've been flying downwind at pattern altitude. Just before turning onto my base leg, I reduced power and descended to about 400 feet.
What airspeed were you holding, Bob?
Normal glide speed. I just throttled back. Well, everybody knows that.
You also made a turn. Did your airspeed change any when you rolled out of the turn?
Yes, I guess it did, a little.
What did you do when you turned into your final approach?
I turned into final with the runway dead ahead. I lined up the nose of the plane and made my final power reduction.
And by this time, your airspeed had slowed considerably, right?
Of course, I closed the throttle.
Okay, you've turned on to final. Did you check your airspeed after you rolled out of the final turn?
Yes, I think so.
What happened then?
Well, I seem to have the situation under control. I'm coming in for a beautiful landing when all of a sudden, the bottom drops out from under me. I stall out before I reach the end of the runway.
You stalled. Any idea why?
I guess maybe I didn't notice my attitude and airspeed.
I guess you didn't. Thank you, Mr. Common Denominator. So far, we've discussed loss of control in a crosswind landing, and a stall in a landing approach. Anybody ever lose control in a takeoff?
Yes, I stalled once in a takeoff.
How'd that happen, Bill?
Well, I was taking off from an airfield I wasn't familiar with. I was on a cross-country trip, a long one, with some friends. And I'd landed at this airport to refuel. Off in the distance, there was a wood-covered ridge that gave me an idea. I decided to try to get off the runway as quickly as possible. You know, simulate a short field takeoff. Well, instead of accelerating to the best angle of climb speed, I tried to start climbing as soon as I felt the plane lift off the runway.
And what happened?
You know what happened. For a while, I thought I might make it. I suppose that temporary cushion of air under the wings fooled me. But of course, I lost the ground effect pretty fast, and my airspeed wasn't near fast enough to sustain my high angle of attack. Naturally, the longer I held the plane in that attitude, the more speed I lost. Instead of carefully lowering the nose to pick up the best angle of climb speed, I tried to keep the plane climbing in an extremely nose-high attitude. It was as though I was trying to hold the nose up with my bare hands. Boy, was that a hard runway. I thought every tooth in my head was coming loose.
Boy, can you imagine doing something as stupid as that? Trying to take off and land without sufficient airspeed.
Well, I don't think it was stupid. I think it was a natural reflex. Don't forget, we're dealing here with human error. I'm sure there are many pilots who've done worse than you, Bill.
And how?
Well, Paul, we're all letting our hair down tonight. Would you care to join us?
I suppose if we're talking about doing stupid things, you'd have to go a long way to beat me.
It was just after I'd gotten my license, about 4 years ago. For me, Sundays couldn't come fast enough. That was my big flying day. On this particular Sunday, I got to the airport early and got ready to go. My starter seemed to have other ideas. It didn't look as though I was going anywhere. My battery was low. So I made all the right settings for a hand start and decided I'd get out and prop the thing myself. I moved the prop into the right position and pulled it through. The engine caught all right, but the next thing I knew, the plane was rolling. It completely got away from me. It sounds funny when I describe it now, but it wasn't very funny at the time. That darn plane rolled over into the ditch, nose down into the dirt and tail up in the air. And don't think I didn't have a lot of explaining to do when the FAA came around the next day.
Paul, that's a perfect example of a human mistake that can plague any one of us. You know, some time ago, a certain pilot took off from this same field for a cross-country flight to Cleveland. This particular pilot has been flying for many years, and like Paul, he got down to the field for a bright and early takeoff. He filed his flight plan, got the weather forecast, and then checked over the plane. First, he checked the mechanic who had serviced the airplane, and then he checked with the gas boy to make sure that both tanks had been filled. And, being a good conscientious pilot, he gave the airplane a line check. I guess he checked just about everything there was to check. By the time he took off, there didn't seem to be anything he had overlooked. He located his first checkpoint on the chart, set his directional gyro with the compass, and settled back to enjoy the flight. And then he noticed the fuel gauge. He couldn't understand it. The plane had been fueled just before takeoff. He was only 10 minutes from the field, and already one tank was almost empty. What could be wrong? Could gas be leaking into the engine compartment from a ruptured fuel line? He couldn't take a chance. He would have to turn back. Since that day, there's been at least one gas cap checking pilot on that field, and that's me.
How did you keep it hushed up for so long?
He must be paying off the mechanic.
That's not so bad. I flew with a pilot a couple of months ago who almost got into trouble twice on the same flight. His name is, well, let's call him Harry. He's a good friend of mine and a good pilot, too. He even has an instrument rating. Harry was very excited about his new plane. He insisted that I fly with him the first chance I had. It was a very well-equipped plane, and Harry was very proud of it. If that plane was mine, I'd have been as proud as Harry. Harry warmed up the airplane and got ready to taxi. Just as he was about to release the brakes, I looked down and saw something I knew couldn't be right. I waited for Harry to do something about it. After all, he was the pilot.
Harry, the fuel selector.
The what? Oh, the fuel selector. Thanks, Chuck.
It was a good takeoff after all. And it was a very nice flight, too. By the time I got back to the field, I was busy figuring out how I could afford a plane like this. Harry had just started his landing checklist when, as we began our turn on base leg, we noticed an aircraft start its takeoff roll. Just as we turned into final, I saw that Harry had forgotten something.
Harry, your landing gear.
Harry didn't say another word.
Not even thank you. He must have been a man of few words.
Well, my boyfriend sure wasn't. He talked me into taking lessons.
You see, about a year ago, Stanley, that's his name, Stanley took me up for my first flight in a light plane. He had just received his private license, and I suppose he was very anxious to impress me with his flying ability. I was a little nervous at first, but once we were up and flying, I loved every minute of it. I wanted to tell Stanley, but he kept up a steady line of chatter about all of the wonderful things in flying.
You see, dear, it's really quite simple. All these complicated gadgets begin to make sense once you get the hang of it.
Uh-huh.
Now, one of the many things you must remember is to be alert. Pay attention to what you're doing at all times.
But Stanley...
You've got to watch out for other aircraft, and you've got to make sure you're clear of all obstructions. And be doubly sure that you don't get so bothered by what's going on inside that you fail to notice what's happening outside. You see, men learn these things more readily. They just naturally seem to have a little more, you know, moxie when it comes to... Hey, what happened?
That's how Stanley talked me into learning how to fly.
Well, I guess the moral of that story, Beverly, is when you're flying, keep your mind on what you're doing or you'll end up in left field. You know, we've discussed many incidents here tonight. Can anybody tell me the two things they all have in common?
They all happened around the airport?
Human error. That's right. In the last 5 years, 58% of all general aviation accidents happened around the airport. And most of those accidents were caused by human error. Now think about that and try not to forget it. Hello? Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Right, sir. I'll take off right away. Right.
Anything wrong, Sam?
No, I was the state aeronautics director. There's a flight instructor clinic tomorrow morning, and I almost forgot. Class dismissed.